at Bond. I'm sure many of the participants will have seen all of us at some stage over the last 12 months, but we're here again with Chris Mayer and Chloe Dickinson from MZN Consulting to look at the challenging issue of managing an NGO in a disrupted world, which I'm sure we're all encountering and continue to encounter over the next 12 months and more, I'm sure. Welcome to Chris, welcome to Chloe, and welcome to you as participants. We're going to show us a few slides. There'll be plenty of chance for discussion and questions at the end. If you've got questions, put them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box, and we'll come to those during the course of the session. The session itself is going to be recorded. We'll send that to you afterwards, along with the slides as well. So yeah, sit back, enjoy the session. And I'll hand you over to Chris to guide you through the slides.
I'm off mute, I guess I am. Good morning, Maya, good morning, Leah, good morning, everybody. I hope you are well over in the UK, and I hope you are healthy. That's the most important thing. Really pleased today to be talking about a more generalist topic of how we actually manage our organizations in this disrupted world. And we want to do this very pragmatically, by taking a look at the lessons we learned from people like you and other NGO leaders who adapted in 2020. And I am sure that we will come up with an interesting discussion after this. For introduction purposes, in case we haven't digitally met yet, my name is Chris, and for my sins, I am a founder and still partially running MZN International, a non-profit consultancy, as I said, as Mike said, for non-profits. And I'm here today with my wonderful colleague Chloe, who will introduce herself maybe.
Hi everyone. Yes, I'm a consultant with MZN, and I work largely on organizational development and business processes. And mostly today, I'm excited to hear your stories, so I can add to what I'm learning about 2020 and moving forward.
Great. So you thought this is a webinar where you learn? No, it's often quite the other way around. Talking points today, I hope you can see my cursor, is simply 4 questions all around surrounding this new normal, which is a term I'm sure we all heard over the last year. And the 4 questions that we would like to talk about and discuss later are: how are we adapting our organization to this new normal? How do we fund our work in this new normal? How do we relate to each other as humans that we all are in this new normal? And how do we get some sort of direction, purpose, or at least the question, what do we know that's already happening in the next decade of development and aid in this new normal? So what do we not have to guess? And there we want to mention some large trends that we can all decide on act now. Good. We'll start, and I've got the honor of taking the first slide today, is how we adapt our organizations. As you know, Chloe, my colleagues, and I have the honor to work with many UK organizations, NGOs, to change, transform, adopt their organizations. And over 2020, we've noticed that some are doing very well, surprisingly well, actually, and really many are not. They are often struggling procedurally, they're often struggling financially, often the one is a result of the other, or they're interrelated. Some have to finally address deep-seated questions of how we fund ourselves that they've been asking themselves without urgency for the last 5 years sometimes, and that are now becoming biting. And I discussed with my colleagues last week, what is really the key difference here? And we've distilled it down to sort of 2 points, and which are obvious when you mention them, but basically the defining difference between those who are doing well and those who aren't is the ability to absorb shocks. And not just absorb them, but use them to build advantage, i.e. more impact. And that seems very obvious. until you start breaking it down. What does it mean? What defines the ability to absorb shocks like COVID and like all the other shocks that are happening concurrently and that are bound to happen over the next decade? And we got it down to, again, we try to be simplistic here, sort of 3 major capacities we need to have as organizations. And number 1 is this robust funding. My colleague Chloe will mention a thing or two about funding in just a minute, but robust funding isn't necessarily always this increase in funding, but knowing that your funding model works in many different ways of regardless how you work, whether it's going to be remote and digital, or whether you're going to work in a network structure or all in a siloed structure, delivering your program from conception to delivery. As I said, my colleague Chloe will mention it a little bit more, and we can talk about a bit more what robust funding means in the Q&A section. The second major capacity that we identified with my colleagues and I were sort of building on strengths. And please highlight building on strengths, not avoiding mistakes, not getting over to until we can all open up again, but really identifying what goes well, what are our strengths, and then transforming and restructuring the organization to build on these, to make these come out better, even to merge with organizations. A month ago, we had a webinar here with Bond where we talked about our experience merging NGOs, and we discussed how mergers are also a great chance to change the organization to build on strength. And the conversation I had with my colleagues around this were basically found the insight that very often what worked before COVID continues to work, maybe in a slightly diminished or maybe in a different way, but building on that and making that come out more is really a key capacity of those NGOs that are doing well. Many of them are also keenly or more keenly aware of the 2080 rules, where they realize of all the things we're talking and doing, really 20% of what we do actually delivers 80% of the impact here. So let's focus on that more. My colleague Joe the other day mentioned that seems to have been nice to have board conversations or nice to have coffee organizations a year ago. Now they're becoming really essential. And obviously, the digital and the network organization is another key capacity. Since we can't go into offices, and again, we'll talk about how long that will continue in a minute, having digital processes is not just important, but absolutely essential. And the networked organization goes within that as well. Networked organization, we talked previously before, it's closely aligned to the concept of agile organizations, where much of the networked purpose is to concentrate on the things we do well, to concentrate on the things that make us unique, and to let that shine more. Outsourcing and delegating almost everything that can be outsourced and delegated to someone else or to a special part of the organization, be it proposal writing, evaluation, data analysis, project development, etc., whatever you can outsource, do. We had an interesting quote here from my friend Tjipke. He's a CEO of Rothschild Holland, and he said, look, we can't save our way out of this. We need to change and build on what we do well. And Rothschild Holland is undergoing a significant restructure and change, not because they, their funding was absolutely crashing, far from it actually, but because they realized these disruptions will continue to happen over the next decade, and we need to change and build on what we do well through steps like these. And I also spoke to donors over the last 6-7 weeks. GIZ in Frankfurt here in Germany, USAID, this reinvigorated USAID in Washington, and obviously Brussels. All of these organizations are really saying, look, we've lost a year. We've got 9 years left until the SDGs are due. And it will take another X amount of time to go back to where we were in 2019. We need to deliver right now, and we work with the organization that can deliver now, regardless of shocks like COVID or the next migration shock or the next climate shock or the next heat wave, whatever it may be. We need to work with organizations that have an established strength, can make that strength deliver in whatever organizational scenario, and predominantly work in a digital manner. So they are ready to go, and they are no longer holding back. And that's a change that I perceived to last year, where everybody, or this time last year, about this time last year, where everybody was starting to freeze and hoping that this would blow over in 2 or 3 months' time. Right, so how do we fund it? And I think that's over to you, Chloe.
Thanks, yeah. Let's talk about what we saw last year and what it might mean for building that robust funding model. So what happened? Across many of our clients, we saw the restricted funding being actually more stable than unrestricted, despite those pipelines being really snarled up and the foundations focusing on their existing portfolios rather than looking for new organizations to work with. As we rapidly replanned our work, we were able to negotiate with some donors to get much more flexibility, costed and no-cost extensions, or to add activities where those organizations were well placed to do so in COVID. But unfortunately, we see that recession is coming. Governments are spending a lot, so we think we're going to see that reversing. So we recommend that now is the time to revisit and rebalance your restricted and unrestricted funding. The most resilient organizations have a really good balance of unrestricted and restricted funds with varying terms so that they overlap, and from a really diverse suite of funders. Now is a better time, as Chris said, to open up conversations with new donors now that their pipelines are opening up again and they're unfreezing. One lesson from a client of ours in the UK who was looking to access EU funding last year was try and be really open to scrapping your fundraising strategy for the time being and being really a lot more flexible with it. Being rigid about those markets you're looking to break into just doesn't work when those governments or foundations aren't open to exploratory conversations. Keep that open dialogue with funders. We saw more and more really open and honest discussions with donors and implementing partners last year, where everyone was facing such uncertainty, everyone was replanning everywhere. We were able to talk about what we did and didn't know, what was and wasn't possible. And I'd say, let's keep that going for the benefit of the sector as a whole. You know, there are lots of opportunities to negotiate with donors at the moment because everything's changing. Programming, the needs on the ground are changing, and a lot of donors are open to those conversations. Also, there's a lot of options to transfer your operations online where they would have been face-to-face. And so I think a lot more donors are quickly becoming up to speed on a lot more innovative technology that will help them do that. And I guess my last point is about this unusual suspects here. The whole world is experiencing COVID. It's all sectors, all businesses, and we all have a stake in how we recover and move on. So we're finding that funding and implementing partners are coming from a more untraditional sectors, I'd say, manufacturing, the motor industry, PR and media, finance, obviously healthcare. And the European Investment Bank is doing more and more in development. So I'd encourage you to look outside your normal sphere of stakeholders and invest in some of those new conversations. So the next piece of this is some lessons we've learned through working with clients, which relate to people and relationships and communications. You can have the best funding model and processes in the world, but actually it's about how we perform them and with each other. So what happened? The future of work arrived early. When COVID hit, we instantly had to work from home. We had to make sure our staff and volunteers were safe, and over time started thinking about their mental well-being as well. We obviously had to change our operations, either stopping or putting things on hold or putting them online. And then we realized that actually we needed to be managing people and our work and ourselves very differently in this situation. I remember at the start of lockdown, McKinsey and Gallup and Harvard and all of those were writing a lot about how remote leadership needed empathy and compassion. And I think we learned that through doing that the key to that is the trust in those relationships with our teams, with our boards, and also with our donors and partners. So the way we relate and communicate has changed in a lot of cases, being much more authentic, more transparent and empathetic. As Katie Crotchy writes in the Harvard Business, it's very difficult not to be the real you when your toddler is tugging on your sleeve in the background of your Zoom meeting.
Yeah.
So, we've been exposed, we're human. We're all going through our mini crises, and we're forced to sort of see past those office dynamics, the events, the busyness. And we're professionals in our different circumstances. And so we're responding to our teams and our partners and our donors really differently. It's no longer just about the work someone does or the funding they offer, but why they do it, what else they want out of it, what makes them tick. And we found using that empathy really boosts morale, but it also grows trust and encourages collaboration. So moving forward, we thought there are some lessons that we can take to keep the benefits of those really personalized relationships. One is to continue to embrace that authenticity and empathy. We can be more sensitive to our team members and their ambitions and needs. I mean, for a huge number of people, COVID has really made us rethink our priorities. So what can your organization do to keep them growing and performing brilliantly? Openness, those honest conversations that we've been having. It's important that we've been able to be more vulnerable about what we do know, what we don't know, what assumptions we're using, what risks there really are, and opening ourselves up to co-developing solutions to that and exploring, really allow others to help you work it out. We don't always have to have all the right answers. And I've seen that with between management teams and their boards, with donors, and also within teams. Two of my clients I know have really changed the way that they report to their boards, much more open, much more looking for input to co-develop that way forward. And I'd love to see us continue being open to failure and adapting as we go. I think no longer should boards and donors need that level of certainty that just isn't there. Innovation. We have learned that strategies and plans are only helpful as a guide and can actually be quite dangerous if we stick to them too rigidly when things are changing so fast.
Yeah.
A lot of successful teams are those with ability to view the changing environment in real time, work things out together, respond rapidly, and innovate. I mean, that is not as easy as it sounds in a world full of nervousness. And we found that some real innovation come from when you switch up your teams or the way you work, encourage new thinking, test ideas. They need to have your full support, whether they fly or they fail. When we test things at MZN, we start small. We give somebody or a small team full autonomy to do what they think within reason. And Chris always says, I expect this not to be right first time. Please feel free to fail. One important consideration is what capabilities do we need to understand and negotiate in this fast changing world? One lesson my client has learned is to cast their net much more widely when recruiting for senior positions. The future of development will need us to partner with and understand a much broader range of stakeholders and sectors. So where can we find those diverse and hybrid people that know about public-private partnerships or commercial contracting, digital innovation? So that increased diversity of mindset sounds brilliant, but it actually brings new challenges and risks when we're remote. It's clear, it's obvious to everyone that there are, working with new types of people from different places all across the world and different backgrounds brings clear benefits to your leadership team. But it is still critical that you are able to work together within your organizational norms and culture. So how do you recruit new senior managers and board members when you can't meet them face to face? How do you know whether they can be a great cultural fit for your team? And the answer, I think, really is you need to spend a lot of time and energy investing in those relationships at all stages. One client I'm working with is currently working with an executive recruitment firm who are themselves learning really quickly about new methods which don't require in-person meetings. One thing they have found is the importance of really articulating your organizational culture and your senior leadership team culture, because those in between the lines communications don't really work so well online unless you really make an effort. Another client had to hold their AGM online, onboard an entire new council and coach them straight into some really hard conversations about financial viability and funding scenarios, all within a month, with members across all time zones and all online. Creating those relationships between the board members and the chief exec and within the board as a team, as a new team, was a challenge that we wouldn't have even comprehended before COVID. And that authenticity in how they related to one another was the key, as well as being open and honest about all the uncertainties and making it clear that they need to really work together as a team, despite it not being what they quite signed up for. And lastly, agile. We've spoken before about the benefits of being a truly agile organization. That, as Chris was saying, it's different to working online or remotely. It's about making roles autonomous and putting in place the management styles, the systems, the metrics that allow people to just get on with what they're really good at without needing a manager to make decisions, checking in, overseeing. And this will mean that the time and the place of work doesn't matter, just results. And again, this needs the building blocks of clarity and trust. There are past webinar presentations on the MZN and BON websites if you want to look more at being agile. Chris, you had some thoughts.
No, I just really thank you for that reflection, in particular also the fact that I can now publicly say that I struggled myself 2 weeks ago and my team was very kind and authentic with me. So thank you very much for that publicly. Let's look at some of the sort of human element behind some of what Chloe just said. One of our clients, Synagogues in the US, has gone a huge agile transformation back in 2019, so just in time, and they realized some of what Chloe just said, far more trial and error. And one of the program managers said to me the other day, saying, we just have less meetings now and more trial and error. And that's really what it's all about. And their program inception rate has gone up. And by me mentioning that metric of program inception rate, which sounds incredibly technical and just means, getting more stuff, more new stuff done, that also reveals that they are becoming more and more data obsessed, which is again something we've talked here previously about. They've just held up a more accurate mirror to themselves and say how well and what it is we are actually doing. Similarly related to that is the quote from a operations director here in Central Europe, where she said our historically grown processes are simply too over-engineered and too slow. We need this to be far more faster, maybe even less perfect, is the way the conversation went. And I thought this was worth sharing because it is worthwhile considering that most of our processes are historically grown. And if anything should make us think about these processes, it is a disruption like COVID and the next. Also interesting, I thought, were these two from a UK charity trustee. The NGO is about, or has now formally defaulted. And he said, look, I knew we're failing when we still talked about going back to normal in summer 2020. And I think that really encapsulated that feeling, saying like there are these people who still think things will go back to exactly the way they were in February 2020. That ain't gonna happen. I will look forward in a minute. And those who will simply refuse to change will simply go extinct. It's hard to say. And here in my hometown, a CEO of an NGO said, very simply, the best thing we did in 2020 was to outsource what we can and concentrate on what we do best. And interestingly enough, that INGO, about mid-level, 6 to 10 million euro turnover a year, outsourced 70% of their listed processes. So again, they went through all the things they do quite methodically and just outsourced them and said, no, actually, it's not quite 2030, but it's 30-70. And that really concentrated the team and did get things done quite well. Also meant that they are far more flexible in terms of funding because they don't need to, they can scale things down faster or up faster. Right. Let's venture a look forward, and then we'll open up it to the general conversation. It's not all sail by sight only. There are large trends which we know are coming in the next few years. We know they already impact our life massively. And if you are deciding about an NGO, if you are running a group of people within your organization, then your organization, or you may well need an answer to some of these questions. And the first one would be, is that my colleagues and my estimate is that about 20 to 40%, let's say a third, of people will stay largely remote. They work efficiently and effectively. They've adjusted their life to remote work. They invested into these desks at home. They may have even moved out of the city and worked elsewhere. And also for those parents here, your kids would miss you too much if you suddenly spend 5 days, 10 hours a week outside of the house. So there are two challenges that we need to find answers for. Assuming that a amount of people may stay largely remote, we need to decide on the role of the office itself. The easiest question is here, do we even need it? Can we scale it down? I told you before that Amsterdam made the decision back in 2019 to shut the last physical office. We used to have 4 and we went completely agile. That was inspired to lower our carbon footprint, and obviously it worked out so far, and thank God we did it. What is the space between the desks we need? What if someone is sick, etc.? What do we do about training and development? We can't stuff 30 people into a room even after COVID. Is this sensible? How do we train? Can we do hybrid events? And is there such a thing like remote mentorship? What happens to our culture? So we need to have answers to these questions. There are many answers. They're not overly complicated, but an answer needs to be given, an answer needs to be set. We also need to adapt the workforce to the requirements of agile, automation, digitalization, and outsourced processes. And that goes well beyond the, let me give you some training on how this new project management tool online works. It goes well beyond the outsourcing of processes. Now you won't work with an internal, you work with an external provider on this proposal development, for example. From my own experience, we've got a couple of colleagues who tend to be on the more experienced age spectrum. I attempted in 2017 to sort of just give them training, and that just didn't change their behavior. It wasn't until we kind of let them do their thing and then provided feedback on it, and then, okay, if that's the way you want to do it, let's change the tool to you, not the other way around, that things became more fluid. Automation is a huge topic here. Lots of processes, particularly in finance, HR, operations, risk management, will simply become more and more automized, need to become more and more automized in order to be scalable strategically faster. That means you might not work with a person. You might have to trust a piece of software or even a bot, as we say. For example, in finance, HR, operations, risk management, etc., these automatic indicators are based on project inception, are run by a bot, run by a piece of software that gives you a green, yellow, or red lighting on saying, is this delayed or is this on top? Let's trust this indication. The other one is, of course, the green recovery. Green recovery is a big one, and it will impact our NGOs as well. 30% of the European 880 billion USD budget between now and 2027 is tied to green and zero carbon emissions. China has committed itself to being net zero in carbon by 2060. Canada, Japan, Australia are all going the same way in similar or even faster timescales. The individual member countries in Europe are formulating similar plans, and there is consensus in Europe, and there's a consensus almost across the world right now produced of being carbon net zero. That means we as leaders need an answer to how do we travel? How do we report our emissions? How do we record them? And how do we get them to zero? Traveling to Kenya for that workshop is never going to come back. In fact, we work with one organization, and they've made the very clear decision to say, look, we will just not fly anymore. Our digital structure allows us to do everything remotely or use the local person. At Amsterdam, we enacted a policy that you can only have 4 flights a year, and you can only fly for a maximum of 3 hours. That means you have a area around yourself where you can fly. I'm based in Hamburg. I could just about get to Beirut, for example. But no, I will no longer do the United Nations General Assembly in New York next year. That will be done by my other colleagues in the US. Shocks will come back frequently. There's a growing consensus that these sort of shocks come back every 5 to 10 years as biodiversity is massively reducing, limiting our resistance to new strains like COVID, but also other, and some of them a bit more frightening. There's also climate shocks. So we as organization leaders should have answers for these questions of how do we simplify and shock-proof our essential processes? What are our essential processes? What needs to keep going under any circumstances? How autonomous can our office, our work clusters work? The shock might be regional. It might not always be as global as COVID. Can they make individual decisions? In Agile seminar, we presented the case of the Beirut bombings and what the local NGOs did there in complete isolation, in complete independence to the head office. And what culture, what skills, what attitude must we have to keep working in the next crisis? And the last 2 trends we also know is that the stakeholder capitalism is really coming of age. It's a huge chance to engage with the corporate world far more. They are far more willing. It's far more in their business principle now to be a stakeholder capitalist actor, but it's also a threat to be partially replaced by them. Note that a huge Dutch MOFA grant recently didn't, on the textile industry, didn't go to an NGO working in the textile industry for 2 decades, but went to Patagonia, the outdoor clothing manufacturer. And it's 9 years until the SDGs are due. That's really a shocking deadline. And we need to have a public answer for how we will get there. As NGOs, your work is very likely related to the SDGs. How are we making up for that lost year? Or are we abandon the ambition right now, in which case we need to have a justification for that. That's the sort of thinking, that's the sort of public explanation that not just our teams, not just ourselves, but also the public is looking for. Right, and that means we're coming to the end after half an hour talk. Just two more insights again. One from Tietke again. You see, I had a large conversation with him where he said, look, the way we find purpose and direction, apart from these 5-6 trends here, is that data and analysis is simply everything. Data is the new steam engines. Know the data and you know what to do. That's an organization which has a full-on drive towards data collection analysis. And one of our US and slash UK hybrid NGO clients said, we are making everything measured. Our work process will automatically include measures of quality and compliance. As a manager, I cannot control the remote team. So it's a bit like what Chloe just said earlier. The role of a manager changes here from that as someone who rides, is on top of the loop and checks a loop, to someone who needs to care more about people and not compliance. Right, and finally, it's my pleasure. I would like to invite, if you're interested, some of you to our first 2021 Think 2030 event. As the name implies, the title is, 1 year down, 9 to go. What shall we focus on now? That will be a hybrid event in Berlin and digital. And if you want to join, please contact my colleague Sarah. And if you want to get in touch with Chloe and me, then our email addresses are down here. That's it from us for now. I'll hand that back over to Mike for any questions, comments we have about these large trends and the areas how to manage an NGO. I'm not sure Mike is there yet. Hey, Mike, are you there?
Has he paused?
I'm not sure, he might have a connection issue as well. Okay, well, given that, we've got a question here from, oh yeah, he's got a connection issue. He's that's just broken. Mike has just left out of the conversation. We've got Trisha Young asking in relationship to the funding, whether we explored whether this was the case for all sides of organization. And yeah, I think it is. I presume, Trisha, that you mean approaching the less usual suspects that Chloe mentioned, going, or do you mean the change in funding from the viability, of unrestricted funding to now restricted funding? If you mean the latter, Trisha, and please feel free to clarify, then yes, I think that is absolutely the case for whichever size organization. Most of our organizations, which vary from 2 to 50 million turnover, 60 million turnover, they experience really the same thing. Whereas in 2020, the unrestricted fundraising was really volatile, and the restricted funding held up, and we expect that to slightly change now. So yes, Trisha, I see your last question there. Hi, Mike.
Hi, sorry I disappeared.
That this is definitely the case for all organizations that I'm in touch with. Mike, whilst you had connectivity issues, we took the question of Trisha Young already, but not anything further.
Actually, I was in a meeting with, it's interesting because I was in a meeting with Trisha yesterday, and she was observing that it's been a very mixed picture in terms of organized. I think you made that point, and her observation was that those organizations that were funded by FCDO, by government, were doing rather less well than those that weren't, and were more self-reliant on a different set of income streams. I think we've talked a bit about this before, a bit in our sessions, about the kind of the sort of UK NGOs obsession with the government as a source of funding comes with a set of dangers, doesn't it, and a set of risks. Yeah, particularly, in the next decade, it's going to be, I would suspect it's going to be even more risky to try and, to have too much reliance on government funding. I don't know whether you want to kind of comment on that, Chris?
No, we did discuss it before. And let's be honest here amongst us. We talked about funding diversification for as long as I've been in the sector, for the last 15 years. And it's now coming, so the chicks are coming home to roost, I think is the expression. It's worthwhile remembering how NGOs started. Have a look at Save the Children back in the 40s and 50s. These were public civil organizations that funded themselves in the wake of the Second World War, predominantly by public engagement. And then in some time, the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations that defined themselves as being non-governmental, became ever more governmental by getting grants and governmental funding to a degree that is unsustainable. And we are experiencing how unsustainable that is. So a robust funding model, asking exactly what is the ideal mix between grant funding, commercial contract funding, and fundraising, i.e. unrestricted, is just incredibly important, and right now the basis of having an organization that is capable to work in the next decade.
I've got a couple of questions. I think probably to you, Chloe. One's around, and because I'm intrigued about this myself, what's the future of trust? How we've talked about authenticity. People talk about authenticity all the time. Plenty of people who seem not very authentic to me talk about their own authenticity. So how do you? It's an overused word. What are we talking about? How do you, practically speaking, what are the actions you take to build trust with your colleagues at work, with your with your stakeholders, partners, donors? What is it? It's a kind of it's a very intangible thing, and I just wonder what we're clutching at straws really and trying to find out what we're talking about. But what would you say? What is it, particularly in these new circumstances? What is it that actually builds trust?
Yeah, great question.
Really difficult question, I know.
I would say that from what I've observed of senior managers and boards who have, I suppose, embodied this for me and created different outputs as a result, there's something there about vulnerability. So allowing people to see your soft underbelly enables them to step into that relationship and help you with it. So saying, for example, yeah, we need to rebudget because I don't know what on earth is going on, and I don't know whether we need to, downsize our staff or, close a country office. What are we going to do? This is what I do know. This is what I don't know. Helps others to say, okay, right, let's get into this. Let's work on this together. And that's how a trusting relationship is formed. Obviously, with that, we also want to present a professional face. You need to be clear, and you need to know around decision making, actually, where does the buck stop? But within that, there's a lot more space for co-development, for working together, for collaboration, which I think enables that trust. Chris, you had a great story of a CEO and a 21-year-old analyst.
Thanks, Chloe. That's a good close. Just before we dive into that story there from the Geneva NGO, there is an element of maybe not quite toxic masculinity, but in terms of masculinity, and with many boards and department heads, if they are male and experienced, there is an almost sometimes societal expectation to be the decision maker, to know the way to go, to be like a General Patton, this is where we go, and I will not show any doubt about my direction. I am Captain Kirk, basically, from the Enterprise, and I know exactly where to set course to. And
I don't want to be questioned.
Sorry? I
don't want to be questioned.
Not in the aim. You can make contribution how we get there, but I will set the target, And there is this, I can tell my own experience, this expectation you grew up in as a male, particularly as a university educated male, that you know where to go after this is where you value yourself. And it's sometimes harder for males to just say, look, man, to say, yeah, you know what, I have no bloody clue. Please help me here, or I'm vulnerable, or I'm really struggling with balancing increased childcare and working from home. Help me out here. I'm really bad at delegation, to quote a personal problem I had in this COVID session, that I had to let go and delegate. That was really tough for me, and I didn't realize it was tough until someone had the guts internally at Amazon to tell me, Chris, you're pretty bad at this. You want some help? And in that story, Chloe, we had this amazing experience on a board presentation, to including external donors. Imagine it to be like the new showroom organization, where the CEO presented some data how they promote peace. It was a peace building organization, and suddenly sort of a 22-year-old analyst from West Africa said there, well, that might be right in all other areas, but this isn't right here. Our indicators show the following. And there was this moment of awkward silence. So, okay. And what I really credit the CEO with saying, well, that is very possible. We have a great data analysis, and there are regional differences, and I'm clearly wrong when we're talking about Senegal in this case. And there was this humbleness to say, yeah, my assumption is definitely not applicable for Senegal. And that really changed the meeting. That really got suddenly a bit more authentic, as Chloe said. That really suddenly conversation was going on. This is on the third day of the board meeting.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Chloe. Just another question on, you talked about going back to normal. So here in the UK, we've got the announcement about what the stages are around coming out of lockdown. The whole thing is about how do we get back to normal? How when are we going to be able to go to a pub? When are we able to go to a football match, go to a restaurant, eating inside out? Meanwhile, we're saying within organizations, there's no going back to normal. So there's two sort of cultural behaviors or thinking going on. So just my observation of Bond, we've made the organization's changed substantially. There's so many things that we've done differently, which have been done better. Just in terms of reach, the amount of the engagement we've had. I just wondered if you could advise people about how do you bank what you've learned, and how do you ensure that there isn't a drift to back to normal? Is there any advice or guidance you could give to people about making sure that doesn't happen?
Yeah, I think I just want to be very clear on this one. I have a similar experience. Like, I work a lot in Switzerland, where they still have the ski slopes open. The ski slopes are a bit like the British pub. We will not shut this down, whatever happens, And these trends I'm sharing again, they are obviously the major trends that's going to stay with us. And I think ultimately, real leaders, real people who have let's be more honest, people who advance a conversation say we need answers to at least these 5, and I'm sure there are 5 more big trends that will stay with us, and we will find, we will define the role of the office. We will see what our essential processes are and how we simplify them, because what COVID has shown us is we might for a few weeks be back at the office. But let's face it, the processes office-bound in international NGOs didn't work well before. We all been in organizations where this decision couldn't be taken because XYZ is on a plane or out of contact for a week. And that can't be happening. So I think I would just ask the questions now in order to start banking them. Put it out there, be more vulnerable, as Chloe said. So like, let's have an answer to the stakeholder capitalism that is really taking hold. How does this change our private sector engagement? How do we make sure that we are not sending people around the world on planes all the time. How do we become net zero carbon effect negative? What should our travel policy should be like? Can we offset? How do we offset? So I think just asking the question will be such a sigh of relief to people working in these organizations, saying, the board, the leader, the department head, the team leader is recognizing that there is a new normal, and at least when these things happen again, not if, but when, there is an advancement in the conversation.
I think that's, I mean, the other observation or the other side of that is not only I think at Bond have we seen different processes and different results, we've also heard different voices from within the organization. It's quite interesting the way a face-to-face meeting isn't always the best means of bringing people out. And actually, some people function much better in an online conversation and more willing to express themselves. Sorry, go on, Chris.
I know. I just want to say I'm one of those. I've actually noticed that to some people, I relate better now. We have far more frequent conversations than these quarterly visits to New York.
Yes.
That said, I'll happily take the invitation of anybody in this group who says, let's go to the pub.
Which does kind of suggest that, anything that you thought of as a norm, for example, that face-to-face meetings are the best form of a meeting, should be questioned before you put it back in place.
Yeah, absolutely. We've onboarded Sarah. This is maybe a good message to sign off with. We onboarded a fairly important team member to Amsterdam over the last month. And we tried something new out. We offered the job. She accepted the job, thank God. And then we started the onboarding, even though it was another 6 weeks until the starting date. The starting date, in a way, didn't matter because she would never go to any office anyway. So by the time her official first day was there, by the time she was sort of online for the first time, she had introductions. She knew everybody. She knew what we wanted to do. She read the resources. She knew she had the major tools on her laptop, and then was the welcome. So, and then the onboarding continues. And I think that is the way, by the way, that apprentices used to be introduced to business. You sort of go there for 1 day a week, then 2 days a week, and then you start fully. I think somewhere in the 70s we lost that.
Yeah. I've got a very interesting question here from Sabrine. Do you see a tension between the need to be open, audacious, innovative as an organization, and maybe donors looking for a safe bet, as you say, has commenced in the last 9 to 10 weeks? What's...
In every proposal, you have the innovation section, you have the value for money section, and you have the green section these days. So you need to write something there, and you need to continuously look for innovation. But I think we should also be honest that if you're working in the provision of shelter for Syrian refugees in southern Turkey, what these people need is a roof and warmth, and there is not an awful lot of innovation you should or can make there. You can scale it, you can put it up faster, and assure the donor that you are looking for more and more innovation. On the other hand, without innovation, I am certain that 20 to 30% of NGOs will just fail, will just go away. We need innovation in order to operate in this new decade. So I think there's a mix between, we can do this, we have safe processes, we have safeguarding, we have solid risk management, we can continue to operate in any sort of, in 90% of the crises that could hit us. Our processes are clear and communicated, even when the person is not in the office and halfway around the world, or even on Mars these days. But we also continue to innovate how we deliver. So I think it's a balance.
Great, thank you. And the hour is upon us. Thanks very much for your questions and contributions from Chloe and Chris. My big takeaway from this is the is it the quote from the War Child CEO? Less meetings, more trial and error.
Yes.
That's, I think that should be posted onto your laptop as we speak. But really, really good session. I've been talking to Chris about how we might do a session similar to this, but specifically for small organizations and the way that they articulate some of these challenges. The way this is articulated applies across the board, but what are the sort of particularities that small organizations might bring to bear on these questions? So thanks again to Chloe and Chris for another really interesting session, and thank you for your participation. No doubt we'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you, Ashlina, and see you very soon.
Yep. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.